I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Peter Langridge, Professor Peter Langridge. I joke, Peter can't stay away from Saskatoon. He's here at least twice a year, speaking, often keynote speakers. He's here for this symposium every year, and he's also a member of the PIRC's International Scientific Advisory Committee. And it's great to have him speak. Peter has been a long time professor in the School of Agriculture, Food and Wine at the University of Adelaide in Australia. He's now recently become an emeritus professor. He's world-renowned in the areas of cereal genomics and translating discoveries in cereal genomics to crop improvement via plant breeding. And just one measure of that, in 2011, he was selected as Australia's Scientist of the Year, not Plant Scientist of the Year, but Scientist of the Year. And so without further ado, I'd welcome up here to present his talk, which is titled, Who is Driving Technology Uptake in Plant Breeding? Peter?
Thanks, Leon. I do seem to keep on coming back to Saskatoon, which is maybe not a good sign, but there seems to be so much happening here at the moment. It's an exciting place in agricultural science generally. Lights are fairly bright here, so I can't actually really see anybody out there. Yeah, okay. So I probably really need to start with a bit of a disclaimer here, because I'm going to talk about plant breeding. I'm going to really follow on some of the points that James made just before the coffee break. I'm going to do it from a slightly different perspective, but because James made some really important points, I don't think it really hurts to repeat some of them. When I saw this title, The Transition from Classical Plant Breeding to the Use of Digital Phenotyping, to me it struck me as a sort of an implied criticism of plant breeders, saying that the problem with plant breeders is they're slow to adopt or to take up new technologies. So a lot of what I want to try and say today is sort of in defense of plant breeders, and I do that from a perspective of not being a plant breeder myself, and I'm hoping that those who follow me who are plant breeders will correct some of my more egregious mistakes. My background is really more in plant molecular biology and genomics, but I've always been interested in the application of that technology to plant breeding. My only experience of plant breeding was when I was a student. I was working on geraniums and doing some genetics in geraniums, and at the time I was doing some crosses, and I produced a new variety of geraniums which I had registered. At the time I thought that would impress my then girlfriend. It was a singularly unsuccessful mating strategy, I can tell you. So, okay. So I thought I would do this by really going back and considering what it is that plant breeders might be trying to achieve in their breeding program. And I thought I'd just present that in the form of the breeder's equation, and there are various ways in which this equation can be presented. Ultimately, the breeders are looking to try and achieve genetic gain for the traits that might be important to them. It might be disease resistance, it may be yield. It's probably going to be a combination of a large range of different traits that they'll be working with in their program. And there are a number of factors that will affect the rate of genetic gain that can be achieved. One is clearly the diversity that's available in the material that they're working with. If there's no real variation for them to work with and select from, they're not going to make much progress. So diversity is important. The sizes of the population the breeders can work with is also important. And in many respects, it's a numbers game. The more plants you can screen and analyze, the greater chance you have of getting new and useful genetic combinations. Then we have the question of heritability. Heritability is important because it essentially gives an indication of the selection intensity that can be implied for that particular trait. So if it's a trait like yield, which can show enormous variation, a huge environmental impact on yield assessment, then in order to try and make genetic gain, you need to do quite extensive analysis of that. If it's a highly heritable trait, and many of the disease resistances may be single gene, highly heritable, you can impose very intense selection pressure and you can achieve fairly rapid gain. So those three factors are going to impact significantly on the rates of gain that will be achieved. And then that's all essentially divided by the duration of the breeding cycle. How quickly can you go through the breeding cycle? So if we're going to try and consider issues related to how modern phenotyping methods may impact upon a breeding program, I think it's useful to try and do it in the context of essentially the four terms that are present in that equation. and to try and look at the way in which phenotyping and high throughput phenotyping in particular may potentially have an impact. And I think we also need to remember that a breeder is juggling resources. I've never met a breeder who believes they have all of the resources, funding, systems in place that they need. They all want more. They're all looking for essentially managing the capabilities they have. Can they sow more plots? Can they do earlier generation screening? How can they deploy and use different technologies? And a lot of the technologies that you're going to hear about, well, you've already heard about and you will hear about next couple of days, are very expensive technologies. So if a breeder is going to use them, they're going to have to sacrifice something else, and something's going to have to drop off the end of their program. So how can we go about this? So I thought I'd look at each of the components of that equation and try and ask some questions about how phenotyping might have an impact and may actually be able to help. And at the end of this talk, I want to sort of return to the whole question about some of the factors that are going to be influencing the adoption rates and the ability of a breeding program to adopt technologies. So clearly, diversity is important. We know that diversity is critical to a breeding program, and the use of genetic resources is really important. And there are options for generating new variation, and this may be through mutagenesis. Now with gene and genome editing, genetic engineering are all good strategies for generating new variation in a sort of a by and large targeted fashion. We do know that we have a problem, by and large, in the use of a lot of material in breeding programs. Breeders tend to like crossing elite lines with elite because that gives them the greatest chance of having a population that they can screen and analyze fairly effectively. But we are seeing increasingly now a drive towards trying to look at ways in which we can make broader use of genetic resources for plant improvement. And there are some special problems and issues that come from that. I've raised two other points on here as well with diversity. One is the issue of, are we actually using the full genome within breeding programs? And are there strategies and approaches we can use to try and access that more effectively? And I'll explain that again in a moment. And then the question of heterosis. As you also saw from James's presentation, the ability to access heterosis in maize improvement has managed to keep on driving up maize yields, whereas for many other self-pollinated crops and inbreeders, we've not seen those rates of gain. So there's a lot of investment now in looking at ways in which we can exploit heterosis. And there are some very interesting phenotyping questions that arise from that as well, because you're essentially trying to do phenotyping in F1 populations. Okay, the question of the use of genetic diversity is, I think, a really important one, and one that we haven't really been able to solve. We know there are an enormous number of genetic resources that are kept in various gene banks around the world. We've seen some spectacular examples of improvements that have come from bringing in essentially unadapted landrace or even wild relatives into breeding programs that can lead to significant jumps in yield. You know, I work a lot with wheat and barley, and there have been some really quite important examples. In wheat, the use of the 1BL1RS translocation, which was essentially a Y chromosome arm translocated onto a wheat chromosome, led to about a 15% jump in yields in many parts of the world. So there are some really dramatic examples of where that can occur, but it's very hard to do that in a systematic fashion. And most of the examples where wild relatives and land races have been used, it's been essentially serendipitous rather than a systematic strategy. There's a wheat variety that's become very important in Europe called Robicus that appears to have become dominated in many of the regions of Europe because of a small introgression from a wild wheat relative that occurred that was originally introduced for disease resistance, but it turned out to have yield benefits. And we've seen a few such examples. So we have no systematic way of evaluating a lot of this germplasm and deciding what can be useful. Part of that's related to this problem of linkage drag and low recombination rates, so very hard to introgress effectively material. And then, in particular, we have no real way of assessing unadapted germplasm for complex traits. You know, we talk about making crosses between with wild relatives and looking for improved drought tolerance, but you know, if we assume that drought tolerance is controlled by 5 to 10 different genomic regions or genes, then we have basically a snowball and hell's chance of being able to bring that into an elite line in a normal crossing strategy. We need to use special techniques for doing that. I think the question of recombination and utilising the variation that we already have within our pool is an important one. And I just put this slide up there. It's probably a little bit hard to see. The diagram there is of the barley genome, and it's comparing essentially the genetic and the physical distance. And you can see that basically in the order of 60 or 70% of the other chromosomes are not involved in recombination at all. And this applies to most large genome species. So in the case of wheat, barley, many of the grain legumes, there's probably well over half of the genetic material, the diversity that's within that population that's not been exploited in breeding programs. So looking at strategies, developing strategies for deploying that and evaluating that is also important. Now, all of these are factors or areas where phenotyping, new phenotyping techniques can potentially play a role by improving the way in which we can assess and evaluate the germplasm. Population size is an interesting one, and I think a lot of the comments that you've heard already this morning, and I think you'll hear in the subsequent talks, are really related to about how can we screen very large populations efficiently, reliably, generate good data from those in a way that, shall we say, supersedes a lot of the current screening methods. And that's a really fairly simple application of new phenotyping techniques. The diagram there is really to try and show you in a fairly standard breeding program, the sorts of numbers that might be involved in that. If the breeding program is making between 500 and 800 crosses, they'll be having something like 2 million F2 plants that are derived from that. At the moment, it's very difficult to do any systematic screening of that. Maybe there'd be some roguing that would go out where the completely silly-looking plants are simply ripped out, but by and large, it's very hard to do any evaluation at that stage. And it's really only at later stages that we can start doing evaluation with the current techniques that are in play. If we could start screening directly in the F2, if we could start developing predictive models for how the plants might perform at that early stage, we could actually have a significant impact upon the flow of material that goes through breeding programs and make sure that when we do get to the later stages of breeding and selection, where things like quality and yield are measured in a systematic fashion, that we know that we've got material that's going to have a high probability of success, which I should say a higher probability of success than at the moment. So a lot of our focus on phenotyping at the moment, which is really very much about looking at our plots, is maybe not the best target to go for. Maybe we should be looking more effective at ways in which we can do that very early screening and start making selections at early generation so that we can enrich the populations as we go forward. So this is this concept of early versus late screening and the ability to essentially play the numbers game more effectively. The question of trait heritability is really an important one because that really gives you an idea of the intensity of selection that can be achieved within a breeding program. And here it's not simply a matter of having new and fancy phenotyping methods, but it's really how we combine those with a range of other methods. So particularly, I think advances that we've seen in the last few decades in biometrics and the way in which we design field trials, the way in which we can actually correct for known factors that will influence performance of the plants under certain circumstances can be really important. And this question about the scale of line evaluation. So higher levels of replication mean that we can also have greater statistical power in our analysis and have a more intense selection for desirable lines. And clearly the question of accuracy of phenotyping becomes really important here. For many traits that can be very important in a breeding program, traits such as yield, the heritability may be only about 0.2 in many cases. If we can double that, then we've essentially doubled the selection intensity that can be achieved, and that obviously has a fairly big impact. So I think combining a lot of these techniques and these analyses can be a really important approach and can have quite a significant impact. So phenotyping, really if we look across the spectrum of those applications that I've just been through there, if we can increase the heritability and increase the population size, we can do that in a range of ways. We've seen examples already today about how we can use fixed environments. But when it comes to looking at field evaluation, field analysis, I think it's also important to consider the other options that we have in dealing with confounding factors that will also have an impact on heritability. So for example, the detailed environment monitoring. So we can then make corrections for variations that might be occurring in rainfall distribution, in temperature patterns and so on, and combine those with the phenotyping data to improve the precision of the phenotyping and the predictive power of the phenotypes that we're generating. So again, this then feeds into the statistical analysis, so a prediction of performance of the plant based upon an integration of these multiple factors, improvements in the spatial analysis of fuel trials so that we are including, for example, edaphic factors into the analysis, and controlling fixed genetic effects. So the concept here is, can we go through an iterative process? We know, for example, that maturity has an enormous impact upon yield, particularly if, let's say, if the plants are going to be faced with a terminal drought scenario. But we know a lot about the genetics of flowering time control, so we can actually include those as fixed values in our analysis and then improve the power of the phenotyping analysis and data that we're generating. So I think combining these different approaches and strategies has an enormous impact. Okay, duration of the breeding cycle is one where there are a number of other new technologies that are coming into play. We heard already from James a bit about genomic selection and the ability of genomic selection to essentially accelerate the breeding cycles. There's been a lot of work on rapid cycling techniques to be able to generate multiple generations in a year. I think in the rapid cycling, particularly some of the technologies that are coming on stream in the horticultural industry and breeding fruit crops, for example, is having an enormous impact there. And then for a lot of plants where you can go to double haploidy and you can take plants to genetic fixation very rapidly, also gives you material that is going to be far more efficient in the phenotyping pathway and process. And then at the bottom there I have this predictive phenotyping. Can we move to a situation where in the very early generation, in the very early developmental stage of the plants, we can actually do reliable predicting of how the plants might perform later in the breeding cycle or later in their growth cycle and growth phase, and therefore essentially start pushing material through more quickly than we did in the past. Hopefully all that sounds reasonable. So that's sort of the areas in which I think we can look at the way phenotyping can interact with a breeding program in which the breeders might be operating. So really going back to the question that I raised at the beginning about who is actually driving the agenda for plant breeding and for the adoption of these new technologies. I think it's important to remember that breeding programs are operating in a very constrained environment, constrained both in terms of their scope, the scale they can work with, in the resources they have available, and they're going to be balancing and juggling resources. So I think as we go through and develop some of these phenotyping platforms, some of these fancy phenotyping platforms are out there, I think we need to bear in mind how they're going to slot in to a breeding program and how they are going to provide an advantage or a benefit to the breeder over the current techniques. So it's not as if they're not phenotyping already, obviously. Plant breeders are intensively phenotyping. Phenotyping has always underpinned plant breeding. What we're trying to do now is offer them a series of new options and new platforms. So I'd sort of invert the question here. It's not so much about how do we get plant breeders to take up this technology. It's really about how do we make sure the technology fits in and slots into the normal breeding regime. And I've come up with a series of factors that I think relate to some of this. Firstly, this question about how does the technology integrate into a breeding program. Are we talking about an existing breeding regime, or are we talking about a completely new breeding strategy and completely new breeding methodology that's based around some of the phenotyping methods, some of the genomics technologies? The first, we need to basically have this trade-off between what breeders are currently using, currently doing. The second is going to be a very expensive approach. We're talking about completely restructuring the way in which we do plant breeding, which I think we should talk about, because I think there are some quite significant, interesting questions, particularly when we start looking at these questions related to the utilization of unadapted genetic resources. Then we're looking at a very different scenario, and the requirements for going into that path are going to be very different. We need to increasingly, I think, look beyond the breeding program itself and the way in which we're evaluating plants, evaluating material fits into a far broader cropping system. So into crop rotations, into agronomic practices. And we're certainly seeing pressure in many parts of the world for addressing some of these, and it's changing some of our breeding objectives and breeding targets. I don't personally have a very high opinion of organic agriculture, I'd have to say, But there's some very interesting technological developments happening in organic agriculture where they need to tackle some fairly major problems with disease management and particularly with weed management. And a lot of this is related to how you deal with rotation systems and how you integrate this into your analysis. And in many respects, I think there's a real opportunity for phenotyping, new phenotyping techniques to come and explore some of those options and avenues. And this also relates to the way in which we fit into the broader environment. The other issue I think that we shouldn't forget is that much of what we do is dominated by our major crops. And while we may look at very good deployment of phenotyping platforms to these, I don't think we shouldn't forget about the opportunities we have to also transition some of the technologies across to minor crops where there isn't going to be the investment in development. You know, so when you're doing an evaluation of phenotyping trial, think about some things that you might not normally have considered in your evaluation, and can you actually provide support to some of those smaller breeding programs. Globally, we also need to consider the question about how the technologies are going to affect breeding programs that are in very poorly resourced parts of the world and where the opportunity for using some of these techniques are not going to exist. And do we risk actually having even a greater divide between the way in which crops are developed in the developed world versus the underdeveloped world? And I think there are some important political implications of that. We should never forget questions about regulation and acceptance of new technologies. I think we work on the basis that phenotyping has been going on forever. A new phenotyping technology is not going to cause any concerns in the community. If anything, I think we've learned in recent decades that the community response to any form of new technology can be somewhat unpredictable. And I think we need to factor that into the way in which we both develop the technologies but also explain and deliver the technologies more broadly. And then, of course, we have the question about how plant variety rights and patents around some of these areas are also going to have an impact. So there are lots of questions, lots of problems, lots of issues, but also lots of opportunities. And I suppose the point that I would try and really make here is, I think as we go through this development phase, and we are still very much a development phase, and I know in particular PERC is really in the phase of still setting up and starting to do a lot of its operations, I think it's important to consider many of these factors. I think it's important to consider the role that the technologies will have within breeding programs and whether we are actually developing them in the most appropriate way to be taken up by breeding programs. Are we actually engaging the breeding programs effectively in what we're trying to develop? Are we also considering some of these other factors that are ultimately going to have a significant role in how effectively we can deploy some of these technologies? And I don't think it's appropriate to basically suggest that it's the plant breeders who are being slow to take up technology. I think it is probably more appropriate to ask the question about, are we developing the technologies that are going to be appropriate to the plant breeders? Thank you.